back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Tonight, part 29 of Mussolini, an Italian American Perspective. Okay, guys, listen up. This is a redo of part 29, which was entitled Mussolini Fascist Thugs, is what I called it, dealing with the pardons of Joe Biden and certain historians that I was made aware of, comparing that to Mussolini. And that cast I did, it got a lot of nice views on it, but I felt the quality of it wasn't up to standard. And there was a lot that I left out. I kind of did it very impromptu and didn't have all my information in place. And digging deeper into it, I wanted to, again, take a mulligan and do this one all over again, okay? Now, as the story goes, I got a call from a friend of mine about a couple of days after Donald Trump's inauguration, and we was talking left and right politics. And he had told me that, in regards to Biden and all the corruption going out the door, pardoning all his, not only all of his family, but these strange preemptive pardons, right? Pardons for people who hadn't been yet accused or charged with any crimes, and sort of the corrupt nature of that move as Biden is going out the door. And I would agree with that. And apparently he was watching a historian on TV somewhere, and I don't know who the historian was, that compared this to the very similar things to what Mussolini had done in Italy when Mussolini was in power and got in some trouble himself. And Mussolini pardoning his own people, protecting his own people, and the corruption that fascist regimes sort of partook in order to keep power. Biden was kind of doing the same thing here. And it's, fascinating because when you go down the path of Mussolini, um, for me, who's read over 24 books on this part of Italian history, I was trying to think off the top of my head as I was talking to my friend. Okay, let me think here. All right, who could they be partying now? Now I haven't read everything Mussolini did, all of his executive decisions when it came, when his time was in power, obviously. But I was thinking, are they talking about the Matteotti scandal? Is that what they're talking about? Because the Matteotti scandal is very nuanced, and I'm like, okay, all right, fine. I kind of let it go, and good friend of mine, good guy, right? And I decided to, do some research on this, even after I did the other podcast, because what I did in the other podcast was I just made an assumption that it was the Matteotti scandal. That was because I heard these comments before in the past, and then last night I decided to do some basic research, and I just did a little search in the Google engine here, and I said, okay, Joe Biden pardons Mussolini, kind of a thing, right? I forgot exactly what I put there. And the first thing that came up was a comparison, a historical comparison of Mussolini giving pardons, but this time he wasn't being compared to Joe Biden. He was being compared to Donald Trump and the January 6th pardons. Oh, you can't make this stuff up. So here are the machinations of American politics, right? The left uses Donald Trump as the example. He's like Mussolini. The right says, no, Joe Biden's like Mussolini, and nobody can give me an accurate description of what fascism in Italy in the 1920s and 30s actually was. None of these guys can really do it. That's the irony of it all. You have to laugh when you hear things like this. And so I delved deeper into this article that I found. Now, I can't confirm that this article is the same article or the same historian that my friend was watching on television. But I decided to go down the path of, okay, close title, Trump steals a strategy from Mussolini's playbook. The former president promised to pardon January 6th insurrections, recalled to fascist strongman tactics. Okay? And so I delved deep into the article, and who they actually quote is a historian by the name of Giat, I believe it's pronounced. She is a, let me see here. You know what? Let me give you some information on her. Her name is Ruth Ben Giat, I believe. Ghiat. All right. And right here on Wikipedia, basic information, is an American history professor and political commentator. She is a scholar on fascism and authoritarian leaders. Ben Giat is a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University. Born in the United States to a Scottish mother and an Israeli Sephardi Jewish father, she grew up in Pacific Palisades. She has a degree in history at UCLA, obtained her PhD in comparative history at Brandeis University, a member in the American Historical Association since 1990. She is the author of a book called Strongman, Mussolini to the Present. Okay, and what's fascinating is this is a book that's all over the place. It's on Amazon. Whenever I go to Barnes and Noble, I see it there. It's one of sort of the primary historical, books that are pushed sort of by the liberal establishment. And it says right here in the biography, she regularly writes for CNN, The Atlantic, The Huffington Post. If you do a simple search on YouTube, she's plastered all over MSNBC. Listen, no offense to Miss Ruth Ben Giat, okay, whoever she is, she's a left-wing hack. That's what it looks like to me, at least. Just doing a basic level search. So it's difficult for me to take this seriously, especially from non-Catholics, and especially when you have, listen, I know this is controversial, going to upset a lot of people, but when you have a Jewish lineage that we know Jews have a big issue against fascism, maybe they have a rightful claim to be angry at fascism historically, but again, I have trouble with what I call secular historians commenting on fascism, especially those that come from Western liberal republics with their liberal paradigm, their liberal view, right? When in fact, Italy was a nation, first and foremost, it was Catholic. And second of all, it was dealing with specific circumstances unique to Italy at that time, right? One of the primary issues, of course, was it was being invaded by Bolsheviks from the Soviet Union, right? And of course, the Western liberal republics would eventually align with Uncle Joe to fight World War II against the Axis powers. If you're telling us not a conflict of interest, then you don't understand how history works. I'm sorry, you don't. And this is part of the problem with this idea of comparing, what do you want to call it, modern American politics and using history as sort of a leverage of sorts, whatever you want to call it now, to make a compare and contrast when you're like, wait a minute, have these people actually ever studied fascism and what it was in Italy at the time and why it rose? It doesn't even make any sense. And this is why I say history has been weaponized. And it's been weaponized at the highest levels, at the university levels. This is why we have all these problems within Western liberal society, and it starts at the university level. Listen, I don't know who Ruth Ben Giat is, and I mean this as no disrespect, but the fact that you go into and lead with the idea that it was the Matteotti scandal that proves the comparison between, again, Trump or Biden and Mussolini, that's crazy to me. Because the Matteotti scandal is a very well-known scandal. It was Mussolini's biggest scandal, and there's a lot of nuance to what happened in Italy in 1924. So I went back to the Nicholas Farrow book, right? And Nicholas Farrow goes deep into the details of the Matteotti scandal, right? Um, and remember, Matteotti, socialist politician. He was kind of a rabble rouser, causing lots of problems. Remember, the parliament in Italy, and this is what Western Democrat commenters don't understand. The parliament was notoriously corrupt in Italy at the time. And, say what you want. I know we have these or these pro-democratic sensibilities where we despise authoritarian rule. I get that. I try and bridge both worlds together and try and give everybody a fair shot. But there's this overwhelming bias by Western liberal pundits where they will rail against authoritarianism, right? and point out every problem with authoritarian governments, but they will overlook the corruption of Western liberal democracies, especially since the end of World War II. All we've seen is the West collapse in absolute moral, political, economic corruption. And this is all overlooked in the name of democracy, the will of the people. As long as we have a choice, we will accept the facade of democracy, right? And then overlook maybe some other styles of governance that don't give us that choice of sorts, even though those societies in some ways were healthier than these democracies, starting with culture and family in Italy. And I can testify to that because my family came from that culture. And let me tell you something, just at the most basic familial level, Italy was a much healthier society than America or England or all of the West today. It was much healthier. Families were together. Families were having children. They were morally sound. They were going to church. It was a strong, robust culture. Nothing that any of these historians can claim that Western liberal republics were superior than those fascist nations. Because remember, those fascist nations, they were all Catholic nations in one capacity or another, trying to deal with modern liberalism, which had infringed in those societies and how they were going to react and ultimately survive from liberalism, ultimately at the end of the day. And this is what is completely missed by liberal secular historians in the West. That's why it's hard to trust any of this, right? So, again, Matteotti scandal, it's crazy to me that we're using that to compare, Mussolini and Biden, and it's nuts to me. But Matteotti, corrupt, or no, should I say, a rabble-rousing socialist, causing problems for the regime. The idea was, okay, we're going to pick him up, rough him up, send a message, kind of a thing. In the process of this, the guy died. He was not murdered from everything we know. Mussolini did not call the hit on Matteotti. It was decentralized fascist squads that took the initiative here. The body was buried in a shallow grave, and a massive scandal erupted throughout Italy when the body was found. Actually, it erupted before the body was found. After the body was found, it was a second scandal or second wave scandal, and Mussolini went through the greatest crisis his regime would ever go through. He was almost ousted from power, okay? Now, just to give you some context here, this is, let me pull this up here, guys, real quick here. This is Nicholas Farrell, right? Mussolini, A New Life. This is how he starts off his section. Now Farrell has at least a dozen pages on the Matteotti scandal. He goes deep into detail on this, okay? And this is how he starts it off. Italy, unlike Britain, say, is a country where the conspiracy theorist is often right. So even where there is no conspiracy, Italians invariably see one. This is what happened with the Matteotti affair. The truth here, as nearly always in life, is as banal as it is simple. Matteotti died by mistake as a result of a cock-up by a gang of fascist thugs. That is not to say that Mussolini was not morally guilty of the crime, nor actually guilty of the initial attempt to cover up the crime. He was in serious trouble. Public opinion has swung against him overnight. Okay? That summer, now he goes on to detail everything that happened in that case. So this leads us to the question, was Mussolini bailing out, pardoning all of his fascist allies as a part of this grand corruption scale, right? Kind of what we see in the Biden administration, kind of what we see in the Trump administration. Well, if you read on, his closest confidants, the people that actually committed the crime, what would you call it? I'm not a legal scholar. Would this be involuntary manslaughter? I'm not sure, because nobody was ever accused of the murder, because the guy, I believe what it was, he had tuberculosis, and in the process, he died of a heart attack. That's what I'd read previously, right? He was a sickly man as it was. And so nobody was actually charged of murder, because that was never the intent. It happened to work out that way, again, because he was a sickly man. But when you read what happened in the Matteotti case, there was arrests and there was punishments. You had the three fascist guys that planned to do this that wound up receiving 5.5 years in jail. And according to these guys, didn't get pardoned. The one guy by the name of Rossi, and you know what? I don't remember his role. He was another guy that I think he was part of planning it as well too. He's the guy that did something more serious, and in the process fled to France in the midst of the trials, because there was 4 trials. Eventually he comes back to Switzerland, settles in Switzerland, and the fascists actually go to Switzerland and set up a trap to capture him and bring him back. Again, it's the fascists bringing him back. They're not just kind of ignoring it because he's an ally of sorts. They bring him back. He gets 30 years in jail, right? But after 10 years served in jail, Mussolini eventually gives him a pardon. Now, you want to say after 10 years, Mussolini, okay, is pardoning his allies? I guess you could say that, but he served 10 years in jail. The guys that planned the thing served 5.5 years in jail. I don't read anything, at least in Farrell's book, who goes deep into this, that guys were being pardoned, that they were not serving time. And see, this is strange simply because after, the clashes between fascists and communists, before Mussolini ascends into power, we know about those clashes. Mussolini gets into power. Mussolini actually starts tampering down on fascist thuggery because he wants to bring the country together. He wants to unify the country. So Mussolini was known for suppressing the fascists and punishing the fascists that went too far. And at times, as I said before, the fascists went too far. Some of the tactics were kind of rough, things like castor oil that would dry people out and people would die, right? But oftentimes, some of these clashes were legit. Like with the massacre in Turin, where initially that was started by the communists. The fascists respond with the Royal Army supporting them. In other words, in that case, and often was the case, the fascists had the legal decree of the king to go in there and take care of this problem. Yeah, they struck back against the Bolsheviks that were murderous thugs themselves. And so let's not make this out like they were a bunch of innocent people. This was a struggle for the soul of Italy. Was never acknowledged by classical liberals, right? Because there's this attempt by classical liberals and libertarian types to say, well, fascism and Marxism, they were simply two sides of the same coin. They were two rival gangs duking it out, kind of a thing. But that doesn't work either, because there was real substantial differences between fascism and communism. Right? The fascists never collectivized. They never robbed people of private property. They never destroyed the church. They never persecuted the proletariat. I mean, and they believed in markets, right? They might have believed in a controlled economy, especially trying to keep out things like usury out of the country and massive national debt, because they didn't want to be controlled by foreign interests, right? Something, ironically enough, that we're all suffering from in the West today. They saw that 100 years ago. We refuse to see that because we've embraced the usury system in the liberal West now. But to say that fascism and communism were the same thing, I mean, just the stance on religion alone was complete polar opposite. Were the fascists, while at first they struggled with it, they were willing to welcome in the church, or at least Mussolini was, right? Because at the end of the day, I see Mussolini as the face of fascism. Because even as fascism, which was a kind of a new ideology that was working itself out, it starts to, Mussolini starts to evolve as a man. And at one point, Mussolini wound up saying, listen, I don't follow fascism. Fascism follows me. So in many ways, what was happening in Italy was, you could argue it was a cult of personality. Without a doubt, Mussolini was doing what he was doing. And we could debate on sort of the intricacies of what fascism was. But the fact that Mussolini made room for the church and negotiating the Lateran Accord, which was happening really when the Matteotti scandal was happening. One of the reasons why Mussolini got saved in the Matteotti scandal was Pope Pius XI came in and said, listen, guys, hold on here, right? The Catholic, it's a nation 98% Catholic. He said, listen, yes, a great, injustice will happen here, but we'll figure this out. The first thing we have to do, though, we have to protect the fascist regime. Because if the fascist regime is taken out, Italy falls to communism. It was that simple. And the church didn't want to go through what the Orthodox Church went through in the Soviet Union, in Russia. 24,000 churches burnt down, tens of thousands of priests and nuns were murdered over there, Christians being murdered left and right, right? The Holodomor, right? That was the wholesale slaughter of Christians in that Ukraine, Russian region over there. There was real reasons to fear a communist takeover of Italy. The Pope recognized this. And he recognized with fascists, at least I could talk to them. They're willing to sit down at the table. And this is how we get the Lateran Accord, something that Mussolini is never given enough credit for, because ultimately we judge Mussolini by that effort and his alliance with the failed Austrian painter, which is another story in and of itself. But up until that time, it was the church that came to save Mussolini, understanding what it was. And a lot of these socialists were embedded in the government. Again, you just can't get classical liberals to ever admit that democracy fails on a lot of different levels. And you can't fix it at the end of the day. Because the argument is democracy is saved by democracy. The way we get rid of corrupt democracy is to vote our way out of corrupt democracy, which never works because it gives us false paradigms, as we have here in America today, right? We're all, at least a lot of conservatives and Christians are feeling a sense of relief. Trump is in power, but, Trump is a big player. And while there's some things I say, hey, okay, right on, a lot of this doesn't change. It's systematic now at this point in time. And so, it's a temporary relief. Democracy at times can react, I will say that, in a proper way. But in general, in the long term, it always fails, as we've seen now for 200 years since the Enlightenment in the West. And we have to acknowledge that. You can't get liberals to acknowledge the problem that democracy has brought, especially since the end of World War II. The corruption of culture, the corruption of politics, the breakdown of the family, the great moral disorders. None of that is ever acknowledged. None of that is ever acknowledged. And here is the case where you had a society, or several societies, nations, Catholic nations, at a period in history where they're being invaded from the East by a bunch of Marxists, and also being pushed around by big bankers in certain Protestant republics that are saying, listen, we don't want none of this. We don't want this Marxism, communism thing. We don't want this Western liberalism thing. They're both two sides of the same coin. How do we protect ourselves? That's why fascism rose, whether you agree with it or not. Whether you believe it or not, whether you believe it's just or not, this is what they were dealing with over there at the end of the day. And who's got an answer for this in the Western liberal republics, like Mrs. Ben-Gaya? Does she have an answer for that? For a Catholic nation that wanted to protect its Catholic heritage. That's what was happening over there. But nobody ever gives an answer to that, because all we say is, well, we got to spread freedom and liberty and economic prosperity all over the world. And how has that worked out? The West has collapsed. The Christian West has collapsed at the end of the day. And listen, I can't put any, sort of judgments of motivation on the heart of Mrs. Ruth Ben-Gaya, but the fact that she is Jewish, maybe she has, what do you want to call it? A dog in this fight that maybe Christianity falls. I don't know. But again, I'd rather have fascist Italy be judged by Catholics. I'd rather have fascist Italy be judged by, people that have a stake in this to get a more accurate representation. Granted, we got to be careful on both sides of the aisle, but we see an industry within history and politics where you have a bunch of secular scholars designed to diminish the role of what fascism or integralism was in those Catholic nations that were simply trying to protect themselves. So this compare and contrast of Biden versus Mussolini or Trump versus Mussolini, these are shenanigans of Western liberal republics trying to, again, use sort of, what do you want to call it? The moral compass of good and evil, because we've cast the Axis powers, as sort of these historical evil entities. Mussolini is thrown into that camp. I'm not here to justify the failed Austrian painter, but in the case of Mussolini, you paint him in a bad light as this tyrannical dictator who was trying to conquer Europe. All of it, which has nuances, of course, because Mussolini was always a very moderate dictator, unlike Stalin and Mao and all the other Marxists that murdered millions of people. Mussolini never did any of that, and yet Mussolini's always thrown into that camp because it's very convenient for liberals, for classical liberals to do this, right? We've never gotten a true representation. And as soon as somebody brings up alternative history and says, wait a minute, yeah, Mussolini might have made some mistakes, but he really wasn't a bad guy. He was looking out for the interests of Italy. As we learned in Patrick Peters' book, Botched Victory, fascism simply worked with Catholic nations. It conformed to Catholic social teachings. It made sense in Italy, but that offends our Western liberal sensibilities. And that's where we impugn our values and everybody else, saying, well, wait a minute, people need freedom. People need free choice. Okay. What free choice do we have in the West today? Right? Even in the midst of all these liberal republics, there's not much of a choice that's left. And national origins are being wiped out through immigration, moral depravity through various, again, social causes. I mean, there's all kinds of chaos in the West, and nobody has an answer to this. The West is falling. It's not falling, it's fallen. And yet these classical liberals simply double down on everything that have gotten us here while using supposed villains of history to justify keeping the facade of liberalism up and running. It's a disgrace. Again, if there are other characters that were pardoned during Mussolini regime, I'd like to reference those. I'm not surprised that it did happen. I just think, again, as in this article here, right, by this historian, it's a far reach to point to the Matteotti scandal. I don't even think it compares. It's honestly, it's totally stupid, to be honest. I don't mean to be mean or anything like that. It just doesn't compare. So there you have it. Biden and Mussolini, one and the same, right? No, I'm not buying that. I'm not buying that at all, guys. Just terrible. Terrible, terrible, terrible. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. Pretty simple. Listen, you guys could read the Nicholas Ferrer book, Mussolini and New Life. He's got all the details there, the Matteotti scandal. Guys, don't buy it. I'm telling you right now. Even Patrick Peters in Botched Victory he touches on it very lightly at the end of the day, basically confirming that Pope Pius XI came to the rescue of Mussolini at that time, needed to. And those are my sources. I got a few of the sources. I got, like I said, a whole bookshelf here of books on Italian fascism and Mussolini, all that which confirm many of the same things. I'll close at this point. Just like there's that one author, his name is Bosworth. That's his last name. He does a lot of writing on Italian history and Italian fascism. I read actually on his Wikipedia page, and excuse me if maybe somebody misrepresents him here, and because I know Wikipedia is not the best source, but I did read on his Wikipedia page the reason why Mr. Bosworth writes on Italian fascism and Mussolini, sort of in a negative connotation, is because he he believes that we must do everything we can to make sure that a movement like fascism never rises again anywhere in the world. And it's like I said before, when you come at it from that kind of political bias, it's hard for me to trust your history because you're looking at it from the lens you want to look at it, predetermined by a political ideology. And that's not how we're supposed to look at history. This is why in this Mussolini series, I have given you the good and the bad with Mussolini. I've told you what I believe he's done good. I told you what I believe he's done bad, some of the mistakes he made. And again, a piece like this by Miss Ruth Ben Ghiat is nothing but a dishonest hit piece, in my opinion, to score political points for the far left movement in America. Again, she's just a historian that makes her rounds on far left media outlets to preach her history. And she has a right to do that. I'm going to say she doesn't have a right to do that. I just disagree with the methodologies and the ideas. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining me here tonight. I just think this is a non-issue. I just let Biden and Trump be who they are. Let's leave the history of Mussolini, Italian fascism, that era. Let's separate the two. There's no comparison. That's my ultimate point here. I want to thank you for joining me. This is part 29. Again, I did a mulligan, guys. I did this one all over again. I hope it came out a little bit better, a little bit more animated, because I've been reading a lot of the stuff and trying to work through the liberal nonsense, and their biases. It's a little frustrating at times, especially as a guy that really cherishes history. I treat it with a sense of great sacredness in many ways. And so there you have it, part 29. Mussolini and Italian American perspective. This is Frank. I want to thank you for joining me. I'll talk to you later, guys. Good night.